There is a moment that happens in almost every bathroom in the world, every single morning, that most people never think about twice. You glance down for half a second, and then you flush, and then you move on with your day. But what if that half second contains more information about your health than your last 3 doctor's visits combined? What if your body has been trying to hand you a report card every single day, and you've been throwing it away without reading it? I want you to sit with that question for a moment, because by the end of this video, you are going to look at something you've ignored your entire life in a completely different way. Not with fear, not with panic, but with the kind of quiet attention that has, in real clinical cases, made the difference between catching something early and catching it too late. My name is Dr. Elena Marsh, and for the better part of 15 years, I have worked in internal medicine with a particular focus on gastrointestinal health in patients over the age of 50. And if there is one thing that has shaped how I practice medicine, it is this. The most dangerous symptoms are rarely the loud ones. The loud ones get you to the emergency room. It's the quiet ones, the ones that don't hurt, don't bleed, don't interrupt your day in any obvious way, that people learn to live with for months, sometimes years, before anyone takes them seriously. Today we're going to talk about digestive health, and specifically about something that doctors call the bowel movement, but which almost nobody has ever been taught to actually look at. Not squeamishly, not in a clinical, cold way, but with genuine curiosity about what your own body is telling you. Because here's the truth that surprises most of my patients. Your gastrointestinal tract is essentially a diagnostic machine that runs a test on your entire body every single day, and it prints the results out for you, and almost nobody picks up the printout. Here's a statistic that tends to reframe this conversation for people. Over the past few decades, national screening guidelines for colorectal cancer have shifted from recommending a first colonoscopy at age 50 to recommending it at age 45. And that change wasn't cosmetic. It happened because researchers noticed a consistent rise in diagnoses among adults younger than the old screening threshold. People who, under the previous guidelines, wouldn't have been screened at all until symptoms were already well underway. That single policy change tells you something important. The disease didn't get more common because of anything mysterious. We simply got better at recognizing who needed to be paying attention and how early that attention needed to start. This video is about giving you that same head start, on your own terms, years before any screening appointment shows up on a calendar. Let's start with something foundational, something that sounds almost too simple to matter, but which most adults genuinely cannot answer correctly if you ask them. What does a healthy bowel movement actually look like? Not vaguely. Specifically. Most people have never been given a real answer to this question because it isn't exactly dinner table conversation, and most doctors have about 12 minutes per appointment and a dozen other things to cover. Here's the answer. A healthy stool is generally soft, well-formed, holds together without being hard, and passes without strain or urgency. In texture, think of something closer to a ripe banana than anything else. Smooth, continuous, not fragmented, not watery. And the color, in the vast majority of healthy cases, sits somewhere in the brown family, ranging from a medium tan to a deep chocolate brown. That color is not random. It comes from a very specific chemical process that starts in an organ most of us rarely think about unless something goes wrong with it: the liver. Here's something that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it. The substance responsible for that brown color starts out as a vivid, almost shocking green. Your liver constantly produces a fluid called bile, which is stored in the gallbladder and released into your small intestine whenever you eat, particularly when you eat fat. Bile's job is to break fat down into smaller pieces so your intestines can absorb it properly. At its source, bile is a deep green, closer to the color of algae than anything you'd expect your body to manufacture. But as it travels the extraordinary length of your digestive tract, roughly 25 feet of tubing coiled inside your abdomen, bacteria and enzymes transform it chemically, step by step, until it emerges as the brown we associate with normal digestion. This matters because it means that color is not decoration. Color is data. When that transformation process gets interrupted, skipped, or altered, the color of what leaves your body changes too. And that change is often the very first external signal that something internal has shifted. This is one of the reasons digestive health specialists pay so much attention to stool color when patients describe symptoms, because unlike blood tests or imaging, this is information you already have access to every single day, for free, without an appointment. So let's build out that picture, piece by piece, because understanding the spectrum of normal and abnormal is what allows you to actually notice when something has changed, rather than dismissing it the way most people do. Start with consistency, because this is usually the first thing people notice, even if they can't quite articulate why it concerns them. On one end of the spectrum, you have stool that is hard, dry, and difficult to pass, sometimes breaking into small, separate pieces rather than staying in one continuous form. This pattern typically points towards slower transit time through the colon. Your large intestine's primary job, beyond housing trillions of bacteria that help you digest, is to reabsorb water from waste material before it exits your body. When things move too slowly through that final stretch, the colon has more time than it needs to pull water out, and what should have been soft and manageable becomes dense and difficult. This is worth understanding, not just as a passing discomfort, but as a genuine physiological event with consequences. Chronic straining associated with this pattern has been linked in clinical literature to increased pressure in the pelvic floor, worsening of hemorrhoids, and even small tears in delicate tissue that can make future bowel movements progressively more uncomfortable, creating a cycle that reinforces itself. Several everyday factors contribute to this pattern, and most of them are more common than people assume. Inadequate water intake is one of the biggest, and it's a sneakier problem than it sounds, because the sensation of thirst becomes a less reliable signal as we age. Many older adults are functionally dehydrated without ever feeling thirsty enough to notice. Low dietary fiber plays a role as well, since fiber adds bulk and helps retain water within stool, making it easier to pass. And certain common medications, including some blood pressure treatments, opioid pain relievers, and iron supplements, are known to slow gut motility as a side effect, something patients are rarely warned about when the prescription is written. Now consider the opposite end of the spectrum. Loose, watery stool that happens for a day or two, usually in response to a specific trigger, whether that's a stomach bug, a course of antibiotics disrupting your gut bacteria, or a meal that simply didn't sit well, is generally your digestive system doing exactly what it's supposed to do, identifying something it doesn't want and clearing it out efficiently. This kind of short-term disruption typically resolves on its own with rest, hydration, and time, and it is not usually a cause for concern. But there is a meaningful distinction between that and something that persists. When loose stool continues for more than roughly 4 weeks, it stops being your body correcting a temporary disruption and starts being your body signaling that it hasn't been able to return to its baseline. The list of possible underlying causes for persistent diarrhea is genuinely broad, ranging from inflammatory bowel conditions to chronic infections to, in less common but medically important cases, structural changes within the intestinal tract that interfere with normal function. None of these categories improve simply by waiting longer, which is why persistent changes lasting several weeks or more generally warrant a conversation with a physician rather than another attempt at a different probiotic or supplement. Now let's talk about color in more depth, because this is where most people have the least accurate information, often filled in by internet searches that either wildly overstate the danger or dismiss everything as harmless. Green stool is probably the color that alarms people the most, and ironically, it's usually the least concerning. If you've been eating a lot of leafy greens, spinach, kale, or foods with green food coloring, the chlorophyll and pigments can shift the color noticeably without any deeper meaning at all. Green can also appear when food is moving through your digestive tract unusually quickly, faster than bile has time to fully complete its transformation into brown. This is generally benign on its own, though if it happens frequently and without an obvious dietary explanation, it can be a subtle clue that your gut transit time has sped up, which is worth mentioning at your next checkup, rather than something requiring urgent attention. Pale, clay-colored, or chalky stool sits in a different category entirely, and this is one worth paying closer attention to. Remember that brown color comes from bile completing its journey correctly. If stool is pale or grayish instead, it often means bile either isn't being produced in adequate amounts or isn't reaching the intestine the way it should. This can stem from a blockage somewhere along the bile duct system, from liver function issues, or from problems with the pancreas, which works closely alongside the bile system to help digest fat. There's also a specific parasitic infection, giardiosis, that classically produces pale, greasy, foul-smelling stool, and it's more common than most people assume, particularly after travel or exposure to untreated water sources. None of these underlying causes tend to resolve on their own, and pale stool that persists beyond a few days deserves a proper medical evaluation rather than a wait-and-see approach. There's a quieter cousin to this pale coloring, one that's easy to notice and even easier to dismiss as nothing more than an odd meal. Stool that appears unusually oily, greasy, or that leaves a film on the surface of the water. This pattern, sometimes referred to clinically as steatorrhea, indicates that fat isn't being absorbed properly by your intestines. Instead of being broken down and taken up by the intestinal wall the way it should be, fat is passing through largely intact. This can point toward insufficient digestive enzyme production by the pancreas, inadequate bile flow, or conditions affecting the lining of the small intestine itself. It's rarely dramatic or painful, which is exactly why it tends to go unmentioned in doctors' visits, even though it's a meaningful signal about how well your body is processing nutrients. And then there are two colors that should move you from casual observation to same-day action, because they represent a category of finding that doctors treat very differently from everything discussed so far. The first is stool that appears black, and specifically, the kind of black that resembles tar. Thick, sticky in texture, and often accompanied by an unusually strong, distinct odor. This is different from the normal dark brown that can result from certain foods or supplements. What you're typically seeing in true tarry black stool is blood that has been digested as it traveled through your upper digestive tract, meaning the esophagus, stomach, or the first section of the small intestine. Blood that enters at that point travels the full remaining length of your gastrointestinal system, and by the time it exits, it has been chemically altered into that distinctive dark tar-like substance. The causes behind this include bleeding ulcers, severe inflammation of the stomach lining, and, in more serious cases, ruptured blood vessels associated with underlying liver disease. Every one of these possibilities is considered a medical emergency, not something to monitor for a few days. It's worth noting that iron supplements can also darken stool, but they don't typically produce the same sticky texture or distinctive smell. So if you're uncertain which you're dealing with, treat it as urgent and get evaluated the same day. The second is bright red blood, visible either coating the surface of the stool or appearing on toilet paper. Because this blood hasn't traveled far through your digestive system, it hasn't undergone the chemical transformation that turns it dark, so it appears in its original, unmistakable red. Hemorrhoids are, statistically, the most common cause of this finding, and they affect a substantial portion of adults at some point in their lives, so there's no need to jump immediately to the most frightening possibility. But here is the pattern that concerns physicians. Many people who have had hemorrhoids in the past automatically attribute any new red blood to that same old cause, without ever having it confirmed. And in a meaningful number of cases, that assumption ends up being wrong, with the actual cause being a polyp, or, less commonly, a more serious growth within the colon that has developed the ability to bleed. Bright red blood that is new, that appears different than usual, or that occurs more frequently than before, deserves an actual medical evaluation by someone who can see the source directly, rather than being explained away based on your memory of a previous unrelated issue. Now I want to bring you to what I consider the single most overlooked signal in everything we've discussed today, because unlike color or consistency, it doesn't get much attention in general health conversations, and yet it can be one of the earliest physical indicators of a structural change inside the colon, appearing well before pain, weight loss, or fatigue ever show up. Its shape. Specifically, stool that has become noticeably narrower than what's typical for you, often described as thin, ribbon-like, or comparable in width to a pencil, and that stays that way consistently, not just for a single unusual day, but across weeks. To understand why this matters, it helps to picture the anatomy involved. Your colon is essentially a muscular tube, roughly 5 feet long, coiled through your abdominal cavity before connecting to the rectum. In a healthy colon, the interior space, or lumen, is wide enough that whatever passes through takes on a full, rounded shape, the way water takes the shape of a wide pipe. But when something changes that internal space, whether it's a growth on the inner wall, swelling from inflammation, or pressure from outside the colon itself, everything that passes through takes on the shape of that narrowed channel. The stool isn't changing on its own. The space it's moving through is changing, and the stool is simply reflecting that shape back to you. There are a number of benign explanations worth ruling out first, including scar tissue from a chronic anal fissure, changes related to diverticular disease, where small pouches form along the colon wall, and in some cases, external pressure from nearby structures. A physician can typically distinguish between these possibilities through examination and appropriate testing. But persistent narrowing is also recognized in medical literature as one of the earlier physical signs associated with colorectal changes that warrant investigation. And the word earlier matters enormously here, because it means this particular signal often shows up while things are still highly manageable, well before more advanced symptoms would ever appear. What makes this especially easy to miss is precisely what makes it important. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't interrupt your routine, and it's subtle enough that unless you're specifically paying attention, weeks can pass without you consciously registering that anything has changed at all. This is a well-documented pattern in behavioral health research more broadly. Our brains are wired to prioritize acute, painful signals over chronic, painless ones, even when the painless ones carry equal or greater long-term significance. It's not a flaw in judgment, it's simply how human attention naturally works, which is exactly why these signals need to be actively looked for rather than passively noticed. In clinical experience, this kind of structural change rarely shows up completely in isolation. It tends to travel with a small cluster of related signals, each easy to dismiss individually, but more meaningful when they appear together. One is a persistent sensation of needing to have a bowel movement, even when very little or nothing actually comes out, sometimes described as a feeling of incompleteness that doesn't resolve no matter what you try. Unlike ordinary constipation, this sensation typically doesn't improve with more water, more fiber, or more physical activity because it isn't being caused by the contents of your digestive system. It's caused by something physical taking up space that your body is registering as a persistent presence. Another related signal is a specific kind of fatigue, different from ordinary tiredness that resolves with a good night's sleep. This fatigue tends to be flatter, more persistent, and less responsive to rest. One physiological explanation for this pattern involves slow, low-volume blood loss that's too minor to visibly notice in the toilet, but that accumulates gradually over weeks and months. As red blood cell counts slowly decline, a condition known as anemia, your body compensates for a while by working harder to circulate the blood it has. Eventually, that compensation becomes insufficient, and the resulting fatigue can feel disproportionate to anything else going on in your life, simply because its root cause isn't related to sleep or stress at all. Alongside this, some people notice a change in their appearance that others pick up on before they do themselves, a friend or family member commenting that they look unusually pale or less vibrant than usual, without anyone quite being able to explain why. Recurring abdominal discomfort that consistently returns to the same specific location, rather than shifting around the way ordinary gas or indigestion typically does, can be another related clue. An unintentional weight loss, meaning a noticeable drop in weight without any corresponding change in diet or exercise, rounds out this cluster of signals that, individually, could stem from dozens of unrelated and often minor causes, but that together deserve a proper medical conversation. I want to be very clear about something here, because it matters both medically and ethically. None of these signs, on their own, point definitively toward any single diagnosis. Each one individually has a long list of far more common, far less serious explanations. Fatigue is usually just fatigue. Abdominal discomfort is usually just digestion. The goal here isn't to send you into a spiral of anxious self-diagnosis after every unusual bathroom trip. The goal is to replace uninformed dismissal with informed observation, so that if a genuine pattern does emerge, particularly a combination involving persistent narrowing of stool, unexplained bleeding, or several of these signals appearing together over a period of weeks, you have the awareness to take it seriously and seek proper evaluation rather than quietly living with it. So what does taking it seriously actually look like in practice? It starts with a conversation with your primary care physician, who can assess your symptoms in the context of your personal and family health history and determine whether referral to a gastroenterologist is appropriate. In many cases, this pathway leads to a colonoscopy, a procedure that understandably carries a certain reputation, largely because of the preparation involved, rather than the procedure itself. It's worth demystifying this a little, because fear of the process is one of the more common reasons people delay evaluation for months or even years longer than they should. A colonoscopy allows a physician to directly visualize the interior of the colon using a thin, flexible camera, rather than relying on inference from external symptoms or imaging alone. It provides direct, high-resolution information about what's actually happening inside that 5-foot tube we discussed earlier. And when the procedure identifies a polyp, a small growth on the colon wall, which is a common finding in adults, particularly as we age, it can frequently be removed in that same session before it has any opportunity to develop further. That distinction matters enormously. A polyp identified and removed during a routine or symptom-driven colonoscopy represents prevention. It's an entirely different outcome category than a growth discovered later, after it has caused more significant symptoms. The procedure itself is typically performed under sedation, meaning most patients recall very little of the experience afterward, and the discomfort people anticipate beforehand is almost universally reported as far less significant than expected. Before we get to that, it's worth spending a moment on the everyday, unglamorous habits that shape almost everything we've talked about, because prevention here isn't nearly as complicated as people assume, and it doesn't require a dramatic lifestyle overhaul. Dietary guidelines generally recommend somewhere between 25 and 38 grams of fiber per day, depending on age and sex, and the vast majority of adults fall well short of that number without realizing it, often getting less than half. Fiber does more than add bulk. Soluble fiber, found in foods like oats, beans, and apples, feeds the specific bacteria in your colon responsible for producing short-chain fatty acids, compounds that appear to support the health of the cells lining your intestinal wall. Insoluble fiber, found in whole grains and vegetable skins, adds the physical structure that keeps transit time moving at a healthy pace, neither too fast nor too slow. Hydration plays a supporting role alongside fiber, since fiber can only do its job properly when there's enough water present for it to absorb. Fiber without adequate fluid can actually make constipation worse rather than better, which is a detail most people are never told. Physical activity matters here too, and not just for the reasons people usually assume. Regular movement, even something as simple as a daily walk, has been associated in research with more consistent gut motility, likely through a combination of mechanical stimulation of the intestines and its broader effects on the nervous system that regulates digestion. And there's a psychological layer worth naming honestly, because the gut and the brain are more directly connected than most people realize, communicating constantly through what researchers call the gut-brain axis. Chronic stress can measurably alter gut motility and the composition of gut bacteria, which is part of why periods of high stress so often coincide with noticeable changes in digestion, changes that resolve once the stress does. None of this means every bathroom change is stress-related. It simply means your digestive system is far more responsive to your daily life, your sleep, your movement, your stress load, and your plate, than most people ever give it credit for. There's one more thread worth connecting before we close, because it ties this entire conversation back to something upstream. Remember that pale, chalky stool we discussed earlier, and how it traces back to reduced or disrupted bile production in the liver? The liver is one of the hardest working, most underappreciated organs in the human body, quietly processing everything you eat, drink, and are exposed to, day after day, usually without complaint, right up until the point where its capacity becomes overwhelmed. Long-term strain on liver function, whether from diet, alcohol, certain medications, or metabolic conditions, can alter bile production and composition in ways that eventually show up exactly where we've been looking this entire time, in the color and consistency of your stool. Understanding your digestive health, in other words, isn't really a conversation about one isolated body part. It's a conversation about an interconnected system, where a change in one organ often surfaces as a signal somewhere else entirely, if you know where and how to look. There's a comparison I find myself returning to often, and it has nothing to do with medicine on the surface. Most homes have a smoke detector, a small device that sits quietly on the ceiling for years, doing absolutely nothing that draws attention to itself, right up until the one moment it needs to. Nobody thinks of that silence as a problem. We've been trained, correctly, to understand that the absence of noise from a smoke detector is exactly what we want, and that its value lies entirely in the rare moment it finally does go off. Your body's early warning signals work almost in reverse, and that reversal is precisely why they get missed so often. A change in stool shape, a shade of color that doesn't match what you're used to, doesn't announce itself with an alarm. It simply sits there, quietly, waiting to be noticed, and unlike a smoke detector, it will not get louder on its own if you ignore it long enough. The people who catch these things early aren't the ones with special medical knowledge or unusual luck. They're the ones who've simply learned to treat the quiet signal with the same seriousness most of us reserve only for the loud one. So here's what I'd like you to take with you after watching this. Not fear, and not the impulse to scrutinize every single bathroom visit with anxious intensity, because that isn't the point, and it isn't healthy either. What I'd like to leave you with instead is a small shift in attention. An awareness that your body has been generating a quiet, daily report on your internal health for your entire life, and that report has always been available to you, free of charge, requiring nothing more than a moment of honest observation. Most days, that report will simply confirm that everything is functioning the way it should, and you'll move on with your morning exactly as you always have. But on the days when something looks different, a color that doesn't fit the usual pattern, a shape that has changed and stayed changed, a sign of blood where there wasn't one before, you'll now have something you didn't have before watching this, the knowledge of what you're looking at, and the clarity to know when it's worth a conversation with someone who can look closer. That, more than any single fact in this video, is what I hope stays with you.